So welcome everyone. Thank you for logging on and attending this evening's program. My name is Matt Schumann. I am a programming librarian here at Carey. Before we begin, just let me know in the chat if you're having any technical issues and I can try to resolve them. And please send any questions via the Q&A, or you can use the raise hand function and I can elevate you to be able to talk. And I'd like to also thank the generous donors to the Carey Library Foundation for helping make tonight's program possible. With us this evening is Francesca Royster. She is a professor of English at DePaul University, where she teaches courses in Shakespeare Studies, Performance Studies, Critical Race Theory, Gender and Queer Theory, and African American Literature. She received her PhD in English from the University of California in Berkeley in 1985. She's the author of several books, including Becoming Cleopatra, The Shifting Image of an Icon, and Sounding Like a No-No, Queer Sounds and Outrageous Acts in the Post-Soul Era, which won honorable mention in the Modern Language Association's William Sanders Scarborough Prize for an outstanding scholarly study of African-American literature or culture. And her newest book, which she'll be talking about tonight, is Black Country Music, Listening for Revolutions. She's published numerous book chapters and scholarly essays in Biography, Journal of Popular Music Studies, Shakespeare Quarterly, Shakespeare Studies, Text and Performance Studies, Performance Research International, and Women in Performance, among others. So now please welcome Francesca.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much for that great introduction, Matt. And I'm really glad to be here and speaking to you all tonight. And I'm here for my study in Chicago. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about my book, well, specifically my chapter, Can the Black Banjo Speak, which is kind of midway in the book, Black Country Music. And I'll talk more or answer any questions about how and why I began writing the book. But this chapter is one where I got to pay homage to one of my very favorite groups that I've been studying in the writing of this book, Our Native Daughters, and they're actually on the cover of the book. Okay. I'm going to read a little bit and then we can ask questions and have conversation. Okay. Songs of our, oh wait, I forgot my presentation. Whoops. Okay, hold on. Here we are. Okay. Songs of Our Native Daughters, an album project first initiated by the multi-instrumentalist Rhiannon Giddens in 2018, together with Smithsonian Folkways, and including Amethyst Kia, Layla McCalla, and Allison Russell, is an example of taking back the tools. The album amplifies the banjo as a past and present medium of Black women's expression, protest, and healing. To use the banjo as a central tool for an album that centers on Black women is risky, precisely because of the ways that Black people have been written out of its history. As Rhiannon Giddens tells her audience in her 2017 keynote address to the International Bluegrass Music Association, to understand how the banjo, which was once the ultimate symbol of African American musical expression, has done a 180 in popular understanding and become the emblem of the mythical white mountaineer, even now in the age of Mumford and Sons and Bella Fleck in Africa and Taj Mahal's colored aristocracy. The average person on the street sees a banjo and still thinks Deliverance or the Beverly Hillbillies. In order to understand the history of the banjo and the history of bluegrass music, we need to move beyond the narratives we've inherited, beyond generalizations that bluegrass is mostly derived from a Scots-Irish tradition with influences from Africa. It is actually a complex Creole music that comes from multiple cultures, African and European and Native. The full truth that is much more interesting and American. As Giddens explains in her liner notes for Songs of Our Native Daughters, the banjo, the instrument first of West African griots, traveling poets, musicians, and storytellers, and then just regular folks, was to become a Creole medium of expression and song for the multiple ethnicities of enslaved peoples coming from Africa, first to the Caribbean and then on to the United States. As the librarian and scholar Dina Epstein documents in her game changing book, Sinful Tunes and Spirituals Black Folk Music to the Civil War, the banjo traveled with enslaved Black people on ships during the Middle Passage. Sometimes captives were forced to exercise with their own instruments on board in order to keep themselves alive and to battle the deep depression at the horror of their conditions. Banjos were incorporated in everyday life for enslaved Black people in the United States, in the Caribbean, at times of rest and socializing, as well as work. For its first 100 years in the United States, the banjo was seen by white commentators as primarily an instrument of Black people, until it became the centerpiece of American popular culture through blackface minstrelsy, a parody of Black life performed by white working class men. Minstrel shows were a way for white men, especially white immigrants, to perform and establish their white identity, though what the historian Eric Lott calls the love and theft of Black musical tradition. The banjo, together with fiddle, tambourines, and bones, were featured prominently in these shows, and with the success of minstrel shows came the emergence of white performers who had mastered their semblance of Black banjo styles, like Dan Emmett and Billy Whitlock of the Virginia Minstrels. This first generation of minstrel performers, in order to master Black banjo styles and repertoires, served as apprentices to Black musicians, closely observing them and even playing with them. But with the increasing commercial success of blackface minstrelsy, a separation eventually developed and led to the eventual erasure of the banjo's connection to actual Black people in the popular imagination, or at least whites no longer had to prove that they had learned their banjo skills from Black people. Songs of Our Native Daughters uses the banjo in new ways, but is very aware of this history. The music of Songs of Our Native Daughters reminds us that we can't understand the past through archives and texts alone. We need music to help us tap into the imaginations of those lost to us. We need music to process the heaviness and pain of the realities of Black enslaved and apartheid life. And what better music than what was with us from the beginnings in this country, and which has been lost to us for so long. Songs of Our Native Daughters offers the stories that have been erased, together with old and new musical sounds and techniques. The Black banjo can provide both a lens and a balm. We call the ones who came before us with music and joy. In the summer of 2019, when I heard that Gittens and Our Native Daughters were going to play at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., I quickly bought tickets for my small family, my partner Annie, our college-aged niece Demetria, who's living with us that summer, and our daughter Cece, who was then 7. We planned a road trip that would also be a research trip, weaving from Chicago to Cedar Point, Ohio, to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and then Washington, D.C., catching up with family and old haunts along the way. In Rhiannon Giddens' liner notes for Songs of Our Native Daughters, she writes that one of her inspirations for taking up the project was also a trip to the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture with her daughter, Ife, who was also 7 at the time. I had been listening to Songs of Our Native Daughters nonstop that summer and playing it for anyone who would listen. And that same summer, I began the journey to learn to play the banjo myself, swallowing my pride and Black girl awkwardness every week to eke out a slow, painful version of Cripple Creek and other tunes, invoking my own small gesture at Black banjo restoration. The lessons were helping me to hear and feel the banjo differently, to recognize the interwoven layers, the percussive power of the claw hammer, the funk that could be captured if you were skillful enough, though admittedly I was not. My thoughtful teachers at the Old Town School of Folk Music here in Chicago, Chris and Dan, have led me to new discoveries of Black banjo musicians, including Sana Ndayi and other Senegalese players of the Akante, one of the banjo's African cousins, the extraordinary Jerron Blind Boy Paxton, Jake Blount, Taj Mahal, and Reverend Gary Davis. Later, with lessons from Suli Greg Wilson, multi instrumentalist, performer, and teacher, I've been absorbing firsthand the important lessons of apprenticeship in the Black banjo tradition as a way of tapping into the instrument's inherent power. Even through the distance of Zoomed meetings from Arizona to Chicago in the months of the COVID pandemic, the funk of this music comes through in Suli's playing and his teasing laughter. I wanted to join my story to the stories of struggle highlighted in Songs of Our Native Daughters. I had begun through memoir the work of bringing together my writerly self with my everyday life as a Black queer mother, adopting and raising a Black girl child with my white partner in Chicago, the city that I once swore shivering on a bus stop as a teenager that I would move away from to somewhere warm and never return. Navigating the racism and classism and other tensions of our gentrifying neighborhood, and then recognizing that I might be a gentrifier too, even when I felt nervous walking past the police station around the corner, and doubling our efforts to combine our blood and chosen family to make community as a way of coping with all of these complexities. Annie and I had been planning a trip to Washington, D.C. since the National Museum of African American History and Culture first opened in 2003. But we had been daunted by the legendary long lines and also by the intensity of the content, especially now that we had Cece. As we prepared for the trip that summer, my father warned us to steer Cece away from the museum's exhibit of Emmett Till's casket. At the age of 12, my father and his all-Black Boy Scout troop had been forced to attend Till's open casket funeral in Chicago, and it remains one of his most vivid memories of racial trauma. Cece had already been learning about slavery in her classroom and at the annual Black History Month assemblies at her school. More significantly, she had experienced her own body as raced as a Black girl in her mostly white school. In her very first week of kindergarten, she had been bullied on the playground by an older white boy, a fifth grader, who told her and her best friend Maya, also Black, that, quote, Black girls are nasty, unquote. Cece had gone through a period of shame about her own dark skin, and Annie and I worked hard to nurture in her a sense of pride and beauty. We wanted Cece's education about our nation's racist history to be thought as thoughtful, accurate, and gentle as we could manage. So after a long day at the museum, really encountering some powerful and often disturbing exhibits and primary documents around the slave trade, we got the chance to go to the concert, and there we waited to just renew ourselves and to heal. So after a long and challenging day at the museum, at last it was time for the concert to begin. Cece, Annie, Dimitri, and I took last family selfies, serious and goofy, capturing our excitement for the show. As the lights lowered, the members of Our Native Daughters appeared on stage, each carrying a banjo like a weapon. All four women were wearing matching jeans jackets with a colorful design of four Black silhouettes, a banjo, and the letters OND. We're a girl gang now, Giddens shouts to our cheers. Giddens describes how powerful it was to wear the jackets as they toured the museum earlier that day, making them feel bolder. We reveled in their style, each with their own take on beauty. Giddens with loose silk purple tunic and bare feet, hair streaked purple and in a ponytail. Russell in a bright flower patterned halter dress. McCullough laid back in a green and red kente cloth summer frock. Kia in black suit pants with suspenders and pork pie hat. The warm red and orange stage lights brought out the varying browns of everyone's skin and gave the audience our own dose of melanin. Each took turns telling stories, teaming up with one another on the songs that they had co-written. Their pleasure in playing together was evident in their appreciative gazes, in their inside jokes and flirtations, and in their shared seriousness as they listened to one another play. As the band launched into Moon Meets the Sun, I got what I had been waiting for all day at the museum. I yearned to know what was happening inside of the enslaved men and women. How did they survive? The song offers their story and their resilient spirit. First, Giddens names the damage. Oh, you steal our children, but we're dancing. Now you make us hate our very skin, but we're dancing. Russell deflects the shame, leaving the judgment up to God, while Kia embraces the stealth of the rabbit and the spider. The smallest will prevail. And with each chorus, those lines, but we're dancing, answer the lament, backed by the bottom of that minstrel banjo. Resilience. We can feel it in our own dancing as they sing to us, grounded like Giddens' bare feet. They invite us into the circle to step into the ring. The women's voices give testimony to resistance to the separation and erasure of home, to the lessons of self-hate. Music and dancing keeps us going, connects us to others, they remind us. This is the recipe for survival. With each song offering a new call and response, a new chance to unburden ourselves with song, I could feel the crowd around me releasing its tension. The concert came to a close with the song You Are Not Alone, a lullaby by Allison Russell, written, she tells the audience, for the young daughters that the women left behind to go on tour, and perhaps for her own younger self. And it was a lullaby for us too. With Russell's voice tender then swelling with feeling, the rhythms rising and falling in a waltz, the song is itself a circle.
Came a little evening star, how bright you are. Anywhere you go, you're not alone. Rocks and books and angel wings, every little shiny thing. Anywhere you go, you're not alone. You're the North Star and the compass, always finding something wondrous. Anywhere you go, you're not alone. In a little evening star, how bright you are. Anywhere you go, you're not alone.
I thought of Cece's yearning to learn more about her birth family that summer, my own yearning too for ancestors whose histories have been lost. I thought of how excited I am whenever I meet an African person in Chicago and they claim me as their own. The woman in the Ethiopian bead store who giggled as we both struggled to get a string of amber over my very large head. And she said, "You must be Ethiopian. You have a head like ours." How happy that made me. As Russell sang the lines, in the cradle of the circle, all the ones who came before you, their strength is yours now. You're not alone. Kias and Giddens banjos plucking feather light, a cobweb subtle but strong, Makala's melancholy cello woven in between. Cece whispered, "It feels like they're singing to me." Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca. That was really touching and a fascinating glimpse into the history. I just want to say, if anyone has any questions, please send them via the Q&A, or you can do the raise hand function. It's interesting with kind of the erasure of the origins with the banjo, similar to like rock, disco, or some dance music genres also originating from Black music. Why are the banjo and country music important aspects of Black history, and why isn't it better known?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I feel like as I read in this section from this chapter, folk music, the banjo, these instruments that have then been taken up for country music have been part of Black survival and creative expression. And so I think it's important to know that this is music that's been with us, as Black people, that's been with us all along. So I think for Black readers and audiences, I really want to put us in the history, in the same way that some Afrofuturist writers, when they write sci-fi, they want to think about Black people in the future and to kind of ask why we aren't there. I think we also can think about why we're not in certain narratives about the past, and that really is an important important aspect. That is the aspect of music. So, if we think about the earliest days of country music as it was becoming a popular form in the 1920s and 30s, there was a really purposeful segregation of musical genres from the people who were, testing out whether or not country music could sell. And so that segregation really mimicked the segregation of Jim Crow, of the Jim Crow system. So there's this idea that only Black audiences would only listen to Black music. And so there was the creation of this genre called race music. And then marketed to white audiences was what was called hillbilly music. And even though and so those kinds of music were treated as if they represented this natural separation of voices and styles. But in fact, there were Black and other musicians of color who were playing on hillbilly music, and there were and as well as being teachers of some of the early country music artists like the Carter Family or Jimmy Rogers. And then on the race music side too, there was much more variation in terms of musicians and also styles. Some of the songs that were kind of figured as kind of race music and blues were Tin Pan Alley songs that were, written by multiracial authors, and sometimes they would take Broadway tunes and sort of present them as race tunes. So there was this artificial segregation, and then I think with that, with what was happening historically in terms of migrations, eventual migrations from the South, this idea of Southern music as um, really kind of imbued with nostalgia for an enslaved past. And so, the marketing of music from the South was also connected to this nostalgia for slavery. So all of that has created, and together with the blackface minstrelsy traditions that I was also talking about, those things have created a really uncomfortable situation, for Black fans and for Black performers. And so in the book, I look at artists who are really intervening in, despite that fabric of tension, to do their own thing. So like um, Tina Turner, Tina Turner's first solo album was a country music album, and she is from the country. She is from Nutbush, Tennessee, and which she sang about with Ike Turner. But this country music cover album, which played the music of Chris Christopherson and Dolly Parton, was her first kind of declaration of independence as an artist. And she gives it her own twist. Or like thinking more recently of someone like Beyonce in Daddy Lessons, and how she puts that song in right in the middle of her album about Black female subjectivity and emotions on the album Lemonade. And in that album too, she's kind of claiming this country identity that's also very complex and layered and not static. So yeah, so I think that in terms of Black history and Black contributions, you can look to the way past, or you can look to the, to the present to find Black artists and fans who are really there. And so, the right to claim country as part of our history is definitely there.
Yeah. I need to hear that Tina Turner album because that's not what I think of with Tina Turner usually, like country music, but that's fascinating. Were just to clarify, were you saying were there sometimes collaborations between like the race music musicians and the hillbilly music musicians?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Patrick Huber is a scholar who's written some about this. But yeah, like in the early periods of, this is like the 1920s and 30s, there were musicians crossed over, and often um, who would get on the photograph for the advertisement of the music would be the person whose body matched the race of either race music or hillbilly music. And then my good friend Charles Hughes, who's a scholar who writes about more contemporary um, country music and soul music, in his book Country Soul, also talks about similar exchanges that were happening in the 1960s and 1970s in like Muscle Shoals and in Memphis and at Stax Studios and in Nashville. And artists, Black and White, would have musicians who would play on both albums or switch back and forth. And um, country music artists would often have Black artists playing on their albums as well. So what I think has happened is that who has been allowed to be successful and kind of visually successful in terms of crossing over is biased in terms of like who's given the freedom, really the creative freedom to move between genres. And it's much more difficult for Black artists to move around or to make a living as country music artists, though, there definitely have been folks who are doing it, like Darius Rucker, Mickey Guyton, Rissy Palmer, and a whole host of other kind of newer artists as well.
Yeah. What do you hope will change about country music in the future?
Well, part of what I hope will change is that the optics of who gets to play country music will become more diverse. And I think that there are activists and also performers who are trying to change that, like change what the typical country music artist looks like in the public imagination. And so there I'm thinking of people like Rissy Palmer, who is in her podcast Color Me Country, every week is raising up um, Black, Latinx, and Indigenous country music artists. And there's so many of them that I could definitely write two or three more books about these figures, because people are like, there are people who've always been there, and then there are new artists. And I think a new hunger um, for more diverse artists, even in country music. So I think that will change the future. Like if we can really normalize country music as a really diverse sound, and that might mean changing some of the rules of the genre and being more flexible in terms of what's counted as country music. And that makes me think about the career of Little Nas X and at least with Old Town Road, the struggle to have that song recognized as country music and being kicked off of the Billboard charts because it wasn't deemed country enough. Like it didn't have enough traditional instruments or structure to be seen or heard as country music. But there are lots of hybrid songs that white artists play. So um, yeah, so I think that in the future, what I hope is that there are enough people who are publicly speaking out against some of those strictures and collaborating across lines of race to perform, so that there's more room for new artists to kind of pick up space and to have success. And with it, I do want to mention that Rissy Palmer has created the Color Me Country Fund, which helps emerging artists, cut albums, especially if they're between or haven't yet gotten an official record label. So I think that kind of activist work is really important because it helps like recognize just the material constraints of being in the music business. And yeah, so I think that those are really important efforts that can change the future. And then just changing in the conversation in terms of books and in terms of yeah, art exhibits. Like I just went to the Power of Women in Country Music to an exhibit in Raleigh that included a multiracial representation of country music artists. So I think art exhibits like that or history, because it's really a history exhibit, can also change the future of country by just changing the representation of it.
Huh. There was a comment in the questions that was back to the first question, but somebody they wanted to point out there's a recording of Jimmy Rogers and Louis Armstrong doing Blue Yodel #9 from the 1920s.
Wow, yeah, that's terrific. Yeah, I was just thinking about Jimmy Rogers and yeah, and I think also Louis Armstrong's wife may have played on that album as well. So thank you for that. Let me see, who was that?
Oh,
Um,
sorry, it's in
Chris-
the answer.
oh, that's okay. I
Oh,
can't say that's okay. That's okay. But thank you. And yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that Blue Yodel #9 and the ways that the yodel has been kind of isolated as a very typical sound for country music. And they say, like, Jimmy Rogers' biographer says that he heard that sound um, from like folks who were working the railway yards, who were African American laborers who were like practicing their yodels. And yodeling is a tradition that actually spans all over the world, but I think it's kind of been pegged as like either like a hillbilly song sound or a German sound, and that's not to say that those traditions don't exist, but there are actually other ways that people are using their voices in other countries too that might be comparative. So yeah, yodeling.
that's very interesting. And what you said too about Lil Nas X and the removal from Billboard. I mean, how do they have like what is there like like a council that determines the criteria of what makes something like country? Like there's so many instances across the music world of genre defying, and that's what helps rejuvenate genres. It's upsetting that there's that discrepancy.
Yeah, and I do wonder if if the constraints of country as a genre might be a little less permeable than other than other genres. It seems to me that way, that it sets there's a kind of a high bar, and I would attribute it to the way that country music has been kind of naturalized as a white sound, and that but I think that those are also open to debate in terms of why that is, but it is, I think, shaped by that history.
Yeah. And I was thinking too of like I think there's instances with like Bela Fleck playing with like jazz musicians.
Yeah,
And I mean, I guess I don't know, like I guess that's jazz country or jazz bluegrass or whatever, but I don't know what I'm getting at. But um who are some great and up and coming performers to look out for? And would you mind sharing with us, or if you want to send to me in an email, like some of the artists that you mentioned tonight, even,
yeah,
but I can send them out in a recap email.
absolutely. Well, I would definitely keep my eyes on the members of our Native Daughters. Since that album, that was 2018, they've each done solo work and new work. Like Rhiannon Giddens is definitely, a shooting star and is wonderful, also as a collaborator and as someone who is making multiple kinds of music. Allison Russell's album Outside Child is also really powerful storytelling. That's her solo album. Layla McCalla did a wonderful soul album kind of drawing on Haitian folk music, and Amethyst Kia also has a solo album. So, and they're both like hardworking artists who I think are continuing to make headway in within country as well as Americana and roots. And I would also mention like folks like Raina Roberts, Chapel Hill, and Mickey Guyton, um, or just some people who come to mind immediately. But if you want to know like new folks, I would recommend two places to go to kind of hear it. And one is what I mentioned before, Rissy Palmer's podcast, Color Me Country. Every January, she has like her class of blank. And so she just posted her class of 2023 of new and emerging artists.
Oh, cool.
And then, if you get a chance to go, go hear live music, there's this amazing venue called the Black Opera Review, which is organized by this amazing music manager and fan, Holly G. And this is the review is like live performances of local artists who are African American who play country music. And so each performance reflects what people are doing in that region. So I think that they're recently played in Berkeley, California, but they played in Chicago, they played in Nashville, they played in New York. And the review is like a collection of five artists and often from the area. I think also Texas. I think they've been to Austin. So yeah, so I think the result of that is that you really see how country music is thriving in all these different areas and people are experimenting with the form. And we might not hear them on country radio, but they're there making music. I also really love the documentary For Love and Country, which also profiles some older and newer country music artists that are based in Nashville. So I would also recommend that to anyone. I think it's directed by Joshua Kissy.
Awesome. There's a question that came in. Where do you place Charlie Pride in the saga of African American artists in country history or country music? Sorry.
Yeah, he's incredibly important. Probably still one of the most visible African Americans in country music. I write about him in my chapter on Darius Rucker because I think both of them are figures who've been able to garner a popularity within mainstream country music, and Charlie Pride was able to get a contract with RCA, and at one point made um, one of the best performing artists for RCA in the 1970s.
Wow.
But I think that there's still the sense that he was operating under a lot of constraints. And even though he was successful and did these great, like toured with Willie Nelson at one point and had his own show and did all this stuff, and had like many mega hits over the course of his career. He also has written about like encountering racism and racialized violence and slurs and things like that, and especially in performing live when he was starting out, because he started out during the late 1960s and really like playing segregated audiences, at a point of great kind of racial tension. And so he kind of had the skills to navigate some of those tensions. But I think, you know, later in his life, he reflected on the psychic costs of that as well. But he's definitely, cited as a really important influence for this newer crop of African American country music artists. And, I think he should be remembered even more than he is, but he's still often cited when asked about Black country music.
Yeah. Um, well, if there's no more questions, I want to thank you for taking time to talk with us tonight and give us this overview. This is absolutely fascinating. And I feel like I have so much new music to listen to and check
Oh,
out. I'm excited.
I'm glad, Matt. And thank you, and thanks to everybody. Thank you for having me. And I was just going to mention, I do have a playlist on Spotify that a friend made for me. And if you look up just my last name, I think it will come up. So I'm not a big Spotify person, but I believe it is that it has some of the music that's mentioned in the book as well as other music as well. So,
Okay, yeah, I will try to find that, and I'll go through the recording and find the different artists that you mentioned in addition to what you just said, and Color Me Country and Black Opera Review, and include that all in the recap. But
okay, great.
thank
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me, Matt.
yeah,
Bye, everybody.
thank you, and thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you. Okay.